Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Jess Lenore in Baltimore. This may not come as a huge shock, but it turns out that even the provisions of Trump's tax cuts that were supposed to help the poor are going to the wealthy instead. That's according to a new report in ProPublica, which found the Baltimore Port Covington development received a special opportunity zone tax break meant for low-income areas, even though it's not poor and the state found it didn't qualify. As though that's not bad enough, the tax break came at the expense of potential investment in one of Baltimore's many low-income neighborhoods. This tax break compounded with the over $500 million in subsidies the city has already granted the project, which is being spearheaded by the firm Sagamore Development, owned by Billionaire Under Armour CEO Kevin Plank. And this news comes amidst growing scrutiny over Baltimore's shocking inequities. On Saturday, water was restored for residents of the Poe Homes public housing projects, but residents say they still lack adequate water pressure after 5 days.
It's a trickle. It's coming out. Like I said, whereas though we can't even flush our toilets, can't take baths, so it's a real, right now, crisis situation, and I'll show you.
City officials announced water was restored late Saturday, but as one resident showed us, the water pressure remains very low. Water is just trickling out of this faucet.
Water, they said, is coming out. This is what they said that's fixed. It's not coming out. That's all we have.
We're joined now by the report's co-author, Jeff Ernsthausen. His piece, One Trump Tax Cut Was Meant to Help the Poor, a Billionaire Ended Up Winning Big. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So start off how you got into this story.
So this is a story that was really driven by data. So we began by looking at the census tracts that were included in this Opportunity Zone program, and we began looking at the ones that seemed like outliers in terms of their level of income and level of poverty. And that's what led us to Port Covington ultimately. We couldn't quite figure out how it qualified. And as we dug deeper, it turned out that the answer to the mystery was it shouldn't have.
And so you did, you had some FOIA requests you put in, and you wrote, as the selection process was underway, a deputy chief of staff to Maryland's governor wrote in an email that you obtained that Port Covington does not qualify as an opportunity zone. Maryland's governor chose the area for the program anyway, after his aides met with lobbyists for Kevin Plank, who owns 40% of the project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so sort of following the data and wondering how this had qualified, we decided to put in some PIA requests with the governor's office and with the Department of Housing and Community Development. And we got back these emails that clearly showed that, one, they had met with the developers, and two, that they were aware that the area was too wealthy to qualify for the program. And
what was the response from the governor's office after you and the developers after you presented them with these findings?
So the developer came back with a statement. They did not answer our specific questions about these findings, and the governor's office also gave us a statement. They did make an official available to talk to us to confirm some details of the meeting.
And so the Trump, as we know, like the Trump tax cuts help the poor, help the wealthy overwhelmingly. And so this was one of the key things, that was one of the key headliners you guys wrote that was supposed to help low-income areas. So talk about how this all actually happened.
Yeah, so this provision in the law, I think got started many years ago by Sean Parker, an early investor in Facebook, who says he had a lot of capital gains and began thinking about how those could be used to transform parts of the world that did not have a lot of investment. The proposal ended up getting backing from Cory Booker, the Democratic senator from New Jersey, and also from Tim Scott, Republican senator from South Carolina. And so it ended up making its way into the huge Trump tax cuts of 2017 as one provision within the law.
And so talk about exactly the map you found and how exactly Port Covington qualified for this.
Yeah, so it's a bit in the mapping weeds, if you will. But basically, we started to ask the Treasury, how did this area get in? And they pointed to this part of the law that says, if an area has low population and it's within this empowerment zone, which is a program from the 1990s with sort of similar goals, then it could qualify. They interpreted within to mean overlapping at all, so they didn't add in any sort of brackets for like, does anyone have to live there, or does it have to be of a certain size? And then it turned out that this ended up allowing in tracts that would have this minimum overlap that isn't actually significant. The map files you're using aren't precise enough to make those judgment calls. And there's a question about whether you should be using them for making these kinds of legal decisions.
And did they have a response to this story?
They reiterated that they made a technical decision to include any tract that overlapped. They did not respond specifically to the question of, this looks a lot like an error.
And it's just a small sort of parking lot in between two parts of a highway that get into Baltimore.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at these two map files, they're both drawing a line down 395, but 395 is 200 feet wide. They just picked two different places on that road, and so they end up with this overlap that's basically at a parking lot. I think it's owned by the state, and it's empty. It's gated off. No one can live there. So it's interesting that a program designed to be aimed towards a low-income area, that someone would make that decision based on this small overlap that no one can possibly even dwell in. There's nobody that could be affected in the Port Covington area by a program that was meant for the area near Camden Yards.
And as you note in your piece, low-income areas were had to be excluded from the selection because Port Covington was selected. So that means like a neighborhood in Brooklyn, which is close by, high poverty rates, lack of opportunity, didn't have this designation.
Yeah, so the way the law is written, the governor can choose 25% of the eligible tracts in Maryland. So by definition, to include Port Covington, some tracts somewhere else that qualified for the program had to be left out. There were three that the city had suggested that were removed by Governor Hogan, and among them was part of Brooklyn, Reservoir Hill, an area over near Edmondson Village.
And you also touch upon the fact that, so these are the latest sort of name for the same type of subsidy or tax break for developers. It's had different sort of forms and over the last few decades. You looked at sort of like the track record of that and how it's being implemented a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about, do these actually have a benefit for local residents?
Well, I think it's an open question. There's nothing in this law that says that the investments must benefit anyone who actually lives there. There's no requirements that you employ people from the area. And there's no reporting requirements. So there's no guarantee that we're ever going to learn whether this program actually benefited anybody or even where investments occurred that aren't publicly announced.
And we were, the Poe Homes came up earlier. It's a public housing project in West Baltimore. And before this interview, you pointed out that also has the same designation. Can you talk about that as well?
Yeah, so the Poe Homes are in a designated opportunity zone. And I think, I'm not aware enough of what sort of development that may be sort of intended to be attracted there. But I think on the one hand, one might argue, well, getting Plank interested and his company interested in opportunity zones brings more people to Baltimore to talk about it. On the other hand, one could also argue that potentially the funds will flow into the most lucrative projects rather than ones that are maybe a little bit more difficult to see the profitability of.
Yeah, and just driving through the city, you can see the disparities between neighborhoods that have historically had investment or historically haven't. This was the first city to have racial segregation in 1910. And, you can see the effects of policies like redlining. I was at the Poe Homes yesterday, and all the neighborhoods around it have, and it's just a mile from where we're sitting right now, but even the adjacent neighborhoods, a lot of the homes are boarded up, and, there's high poverty rates. They haven't had water for a week, but they point to just, the residents there point to systemic disinvestment there, which is, true of many neighborhoods outside of the core part of Baltimore, like where Port Covington is, which is getting, in total, over $2 billion in subsidies from the state and local officials.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Jeff Ernsthausen, thank you so much for coming on and talking about your piece.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
And thank you for joining us at the Real News Network.